So, if you've ever taken a macroeconomics class, you have definitely seen this one graph. It's kind of the big one, the model that pulls everything together to help us understand things like recessions, inflation, and, well, economic growth. Today, we are going to tackle what is arguably the most important graph in all of macroeconomics, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model.
Okay, so let's just dive right in. When you first see this model, it can absolutely feel like a Rubik's Cube, just this, colorful, confusing mess. But here's the thing about a Rubik's Cube. Once you learn the moves, once you get the logic behind it, it's not so scary anymore. It becomes solvable. It's all about knowing the procedures and just getting in a little practice. And I promise, by the end of this, you're going to have that procedure down.
So, here's our game plan. We're going to treat this like we're solving the macroeconomics puzzle. First, we'll break down one side of the board, all about aggregate demand. Then we'll get into the tricky part, the two sides of supply. And finally, we'll put all those pieces together so you can really master this model.
All right, first up, aggregate demand. I want you to think of this as the demand for literally everything that's produced in an entire country, all added up into one giant pile.
That word aggregate, it really just means add it all together. So this one curve represents the demand for every car, every loaf of bread, every computer, the whole shebang. Now, because we're talking about so many different things at once, we can't just use price and quantity like you would in a normal market graph. Instead, that y-axis shows the overall price level for the entire economy, and the x-axis shows real GDP, which is basically the total quantity of everything.
So this brings up a really important question. Why does this curve slope downward? I mean, with a simple demand curve, it's pretty straightforward. But here, it's a little more complex. There are actually three big effects at play, and we're going to walk through each one right now.
First is what we call the real wealth effect. And this one is all about us, the consumers. It's actually pretty intuitive. When the overall price level in the economy goes down, the money you've got saved up can suddenly buy more stuff, right? Your purchasing power goes up, so you feel a little wealthier. And what do? You tend to buy more. Okay, next up is the interest rate effect. And this one focuses more on businesses and investors. Think about it. If the price level rises, we all have to spend more on just our daily needs, which usually means we save less. When there's less savings in banks, there's less money available for loans. That pushes up interest rates, making it more expensive for businesses to borrow and invest in new projects. So they spend less.
And finally, the third piece of the puzzle is the exchange rate effect. And this is all about international trade. Let's say the price level in the US goes up. Well, that means our goods just got more expensive compared to goods made in other countries. So what happens? People in other countries buy less of our stuff, and our exports fall. And there you have it. All three of those effects explain that downward slope.
So that explains why we move along the curve. But what makes the entire curve pack up and shift to the left or the right? Well, that's a whole different ballgame. That's all driven by changes in the four big components of GDP: consumer spending, business investment, government spending, and net exports. If any of those change, the whole 80 curve moves.
Okay, let's try a quick practice scenario. What do you think happens to aggregate demand here in the US if the stock market just goes on a major tear? Which one of those components is going to feel it?
If you said aggregate demand increases, you are 100% right. A stock market boom makes people feel wealthier, and that leads to a big increase in consumer spending, which pushes the entire AD curve out to the right.
All right, one more for you. What happens to aggregate demand if the government decides to pass a pretty significant increase in income taxes?
And the answer is aggregate demand decreases. Higher income taxes mean we all have less disposable income, right? So that cuts back on consumer spending and shifts the AD curve to the left. Now here's a crucial point. When you're doing these, just identify the very first thing that changes. Don't start thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. Just focus on that initial shift.
All right, let's move on. We've got the demand side handled, so let's check out the other side of the economy, supply. Now this is where things get just a little bit more complex, because unlike demand, we're not talking about one curve here. We've actually got 2 different aggregate supply curves to understand.
And this, right here, illustrates the difference perfectly. So in the short run, the supply curve slopes upward. Why is that? Well, imagine the price level rises, but things like wages and other costs are kind of sticky. They don't change right away. For a little while, firms can make more profit, so they have a real incentive to produce more stuff. But in the long run, that supply curve is totally vertical. That's because, eventually, everything catches up. Wages adjust. In the long run, the economy's total output isn't decided by the price level, it's determined by its real resources, its technology, its capital, its labor force. That vertical line is the economy's full potential.
So, what can actually shift that short-run curve? Well, it's all about things that change how much it costs to produce things across the whole economy. A sudden spike in oil prices, a big cut in corporate taxes, a game-changing new technology, all of those would shift it. For a real-world example, just think about those supply chain nightmares we had a little while back. That was basically a sudden increase in resource costs for everybody, and it shifted that short-run supply curve to the left, which helped fuel inflation.
So here's the really cool part. How does the short run actually connect to the long run? Imagine the price level goes up, okay? In the short run, firms start producing more. But then, workers, they start to realize, hey, everything's more expensive, and they demand higher wages. As those nominal wages rise, production costs for firms go up, and that increase in costs shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve back to the left. The economy ends up right back at its long-run potential, just with a higher price level. It basically self-corrects over time.
All right, you know the drill. Time for a supply-side practice question. What happens to the short-run aggregate supply curve if nominal wages go up all across the economy?
The short-run aggregate supply curve decreases. Yep, it shifts to the left. Because higher wages are a direct increase in the cost of a super important resource, labor. That just makes it more expensive for firms to produce anything at any given price level.
Perfect. But wait, here is the really critical follow-up question. What happens to the long-run aggregate supply curve if nominal wages increase?
And the answer is absolutely nothing. This is such a key distinction to get. The long-run curve is all about real things. The actual number of workers we have, the amount of physical capital, the level of our technology. Simply paying those same workers higher nominal wages doesn't magically change the economy's fundamental ability to produce stuff.
And that brings us to the final piece of our puzzle, mastering the model. We've looked at all the different parts, and now it's just about putting them all together. Look, these models are incredible tools, for sure, but they're also a simplification. Let's be honest, the real world is infinitely more complex. But that's exactly why we use them, to help us cut through all that noise and really understand the core mechanics of what's going on. And just like that Rubik's Cube, the key to really getting it isn't just watching someone else do it, it's practicing over and over until those moves just become second nature.
Hey, if this explainer helped you finally solve that aggregate demand and supply puzzle, let us know by hitting that like button. And be sure to subscribe for more explainers that make complex topics simple. Thanks so much for watching.